Hello, I welcome you all in this presentation related with the subject materials processing fundamentals and practical. And we are talking about the practical and lab demonstrations. In this particular presentation, I will be talking about the gas tungsten arc welding, also known as tungsten inert gas welding. Okay, so the tungsten inert gas welding in short form is termed as a TIG welding. So we will be talking about the systems related with the TIG welding and the practices which are used for development of the weld joints of the similar steels and dissimilar steels. Also, we will try to talk about that how the welding conditions affect the joint characteristics. So, what we are going to learn from this practical, we will be learning about the following, okay, different system components related with the GTAW. So, there is a power source for the GTAW which basically supplies very low welding current, welding voltage, okay, which is usually like say ranges say from for which is normally used is 10 to 20 volt, and the current can range on the higher side like say 50 to 300 or 400 ampere depending upon the system capacity. If it is low capacity welding transformer, then these are air cooled. Otherwise, high capacity welding transformers for the GTAW are water cooled. Okay, we will also try to see how the GTAW is performed for joining of the metals, and we will also try to see like how the weld joint characteristics are affected when the similar metal weld joints are developed or the dissimilar metal weld joints are developed by the GTAW process. So, similar steel welding and we will be taking up these two types of cases, similar steel welding and dissimilar steel welding. Okay, what is the difference? Although I have already talked about, like say these are the two steel plates of the similar steels. Okay, so when the heat is supplied at the center, due to the similar kind of the thermal conductivity and other thermal properties, thermal expansion behavior, we get almost symmetric weld joint because equal melting of the base metal both the sides take place. Okay, but when we deal with the dissimilar steels, say one side we have austenitic stainless steel, another side we have ferritic steels. So, thermal conductivity of the ferritic steel is much higher as compared to that of the ASS side. So, because of the high thermal conductivity, more heat is transported towards the ferritic steel side, and therefore, what we find, the greater the weld pool is shifted towards the ferritic steel side and very less melting takes place on the austenitic stainless steel side, and therefore, what we find, the asymmetric the weld joint. So, it is very much possible that we may get the weld joint where there is no melting at the bottom of the austenitic stainless steel side and only little melting at the top takes place. So, the weld joint is actually not developed because there is a significant region which is left unwelded. Okay. So, therefore, it is very important that we need to consider whether it is similar welding, similar steel welding or dissimilar steel welding, and accordingly we have to take the corrective measures for obtaining the symmetric weld joint. So, as far as materials and methods are concerned, like GTAW system including the suitable welding torch. So, the power source is one. With the help of the suitable cables, the power will be delivered to the welding torch. Torch will be having the electrode with the suitable electrode holders. Okay, we also need the parent metals which need to be welded. These can be aluminum, this can be steel or any other combination as per the need of the application. Welding tractor which will help to provide the controlled movement to the torch, so that when welding tractors are used, they provide the automated movement to the welding torch, so that the can move at a particular speed. Otherwise, because in manual welding there is always fluctuation in terms of the speed at which the welding is done. So, the welding tractors provide the constant heat input for a given setting of the current and voltage. We also need the inert gases, not the inactive gases like CO2, but we need the argon and helium, because if the CO2 is used, then what CO2 will be using? It will be producing the oxygen, and oxygen will damage the tungsten electrode. So, invariably we use the inert gases like argon and the helium. Okay. So, suitable inert gas cylinders need to be used for protecting the weld pool against the atmospheric gases. As far as performance welding is concerned, depending upon the section thickness, if it is less than 5 mm, say 3 mm, 4 mm, then what we do? We need to just prepare the edges square, okay, and these are placed with the little gap of like say 1 to 2 mm, okay, and then heat is applied with the help of the TIG arc, and melting of the fin surfaces results in the development of the molten weld pool, which later on after the solidification results in the metallurgical continuity in form of the developed weld joint. But if the section thickness is more, then due to the low heat input the approach of the process, we may not be able to melt the through thickness. The through thickness penetration may not be possible, because when heat is supplied which is less, like say 0.5 kilojoule per mm, this much heat may not be able to, may not be good enough for through thickness melting if the plate thickness is say 8 mm or 6 mm. In that case, the melting may be partial. Thickness, the depth up to which the melting will be taking place, that will be partial. So, there will be unmelted zone or lack of penetration kind of the issue will be observed. So, to avoid this kind of situation, when especially when we are using the square edges, it is important that edges are prepared. So, edges are prepared, maybe we can use the V groove preparation, single V groove, single U groove, single J bevel, or a double V, double J, as per the thickness of the sheet. So, when the edges are prepared, then our electrode can reach near the bottom side, and then there can help in melting the fin surfaces at the root, and then the welding is done in subsequently in the other areas. So, the basically the TIG welding is a non-consumable, uses the welding electrode which is non-consumable. So, if we have to fill the gap, if there is a groove and that groove has to be filled in, then we need to use suitable filler metal. So, the filler metal is fed in the zone. So, what we do, basically say this is the gap which has been prepared, groove which has been prepared, and this is where our arc is. And so, in the arc zone we feed the filler wire. So, the filler wire melts with the heat of arc, and thereby it transfers the molten metal in between the plates to be welded to fill the gap. So, the filler metal in GTAW basically used to fill the gap, okay, or fill the groove. So, the filler metal, that will be the requirement, especially when we are dealing with the thick plates. We need, so after preparing the edges, what is the next job? Say these are the plates which has been prepared, and this is the weld line. So, we have to do the tack welding first. Tack welding helps to maintain the relative position of the two plates in proper position. Once this tacking is done, using the suitable welding process parameters, the melting along the weld line is realized, and which after the solidification helps in development of the weld joint. So, here it is very important that voltage, current and speeds are selected in such a way that we are able to realize the single pass penetration. In case of the relatively single pass, we are able to realize the through thickness penetration in single pass welding, especially when we are dealing with the relatively thin sheets. Okay. So, here net heat input needs to be controlled accordingly to realize the through thickness penetration in single pass, and for that Vi by S needs to be controlled in such a way that we are able to have this through thickness penetration. Okay. And we have to also assume the suitable thermal efficiency, or the amount of heat that will be transferred for actual melting of the parent metal. So, the TIG welding usually work with the low voltages, maybe like say 20 to 20 volt, and the current can range as per the thickness 50 to say 400 ampere, and the welding speed like say 30 to even 150 per minute kind of the welding speed can be used. So, voltage, current and speed combination need to be identified, or it is to be established in such a way that we are able to realize the through thickness penetration in a single pass, especially when we are dealing with the relatively thin sheets. If it is thick, then certainly we have to go for the multi pass welding, and in that case we usually low heat input is used, so that in each pass little less amount of the metal is deposited. Okay, in case of the multi-pass welding, once the joint has been developed, say this is the joint which has been developed, okay, after melting the fixed surfaces, then it is important to characterize the weld bead geometry. This is one. Then we have to also see the kind of the heat affected zone characteristics, or if there is any defect of the micro size or micron size or micro size, or also to study the microstructure of the weld and the heat affected zone, both the sides. Okay. So, for that it is important that a transverse section of the weld joint is prepared by grinding, followed by polishing and then etching for microscopy, and then perform the optical microscopy and capture the microstructural images and perform the micro hardness test or hardness test in the different zones, say in the base metal, in the heat affected zone and in the weld zone, to see how the properties are getting affected because of the welding or due to the use of particular kind of the filler metal. So, it is very important that macroscopy of the weld joint is performed. So, for the microscopy basically we use the stereoscope. Okay. For the TIG welding we have to use one TIG welding machine. So, this is welding transformer and with the suitable cylinders for supply of the inert gases, and the welding tractor we need to use for controlled movement of the welding torch, and this is like if we are using a mixture of the argon plus helium, then we need to use the suitable gas mixture equipment, so that in different portions argon and helium can be supplied for protecting the weld pool from the atmospheric gases. And then there is a backing plate and then a welding torch that will be moved with the help of the welding tractor. This is a kind of system which is used for development of the weld joint. Now, we will see the demonstration of the TIG welding process. Hello students, in this practical we will be demonstrating the gas tungsten arc welding, or this is also known as tungsten inert gas welding process, which is primarily used for development of the high quality weld joints, because the TIG process helps to develop the you can say the best quality weld joints with regard to the impurities and with regard to the heat input among the other arc welding processes, because it is a very low heat input process. It helps to establish the arc using very low heat input, and the application of the inert gas like helium or argon for protecting the weld pool during the welding, coupled with a very small arc length, allows the cleanest weld in terms of the oxygen content and nitrogen content in the weld metal. Here you can see this process TIG welding is based on the principle of using the arc heat developed between the base metal and the non-consumable tungsten electrode. So, here we use the welding power supply. Welding power supply, comparatively it is of the low capacity range, say it has both the options DC, which is used for development of the high quality steel weld joints, and AC setting is used for the welding of the non-ferrous metals. And here you can see there is an option for both the pulsing the welding current, where we can set the background current and the peak current, and the welding also can be done at using the constant current as per the need of the heat to be generated for joining the sheets of a given thickness. Okay. So, if we see the setup here, so here there are two terminals in the welding power source. So, one is of the earthing and another terminal is connected to the welding torch. So, this is the torch. You can say here there is a knob for on and off, and this is the you can say the nozzle, and here inside we will be having the tungsten electrode. So, the tungsten electrode can be seen here. This is the inside, we can see inside the nozzle there is a small tungsten electrode projecting little bit beyond the nozzle. So here arc is striked between the tungsten electrode and workpiece, and whenever the circuit is complete through the proper setting of the welding current and the voltage setting is also like it works at very low voltage, maybe 10, 12, 15 volt kind of thing. So when the for a given current and voltage setting, whenever the electrode is brought in contact with the workpiece and then it is touched apart, the arc is initiated, or nowadays we have the high frequency arc initiation methods also, where there is no need to touch the electrode and arc is struck between the base metal and the electrode automatically whenever it is brought close to, and the process is switched on, means the process is initiated. So the field emission approach is used in that case. So here if we see in this case, since this is a tungsten inert gas process, so here it uses the tungsten electrode, and for protecting the weld metal from the atmospheric gases, the inert gas is used as a shielding gas, and which is supplied through the suitable cylinder of the argon or the helium as per the kind of quality and the purpose or the criticality of the application for which the joint is to be developed. Since the process works at very low level of current, therefore heat generation is very less, and therefore thermal damage to the base metal because of the welding will also be limited. So now here what we have seen the different parts and the components. Now we will see the step by step demonstration of the TIG welding process. So as you know, like any welding process, we have to set the current and the voltage in light of the electrode, and the heat to be used, heat to be generated for development of the weld joint in light of the thickness of the sheet to be joined. So thicker will be the sheet, greater will be the heat input required, so greater will be the current setting that we need to use. For tungsten electrode, the voltage is normally fixed, like say it may be like 12 or 15, like that. So basically the current setting or the type of the current, like AC or DC, or the type of the kind of whether it will be constant current or the pulse in current. So there are different aspects related with the use of the TIG welding, and as per the need of the application of the weld joint or the way by which we want to develop an acceptable weld joint, we may use the constant current or the pulse current. Pulse current option is primarily used for developing the low heat input weld joints. Okay. So now we will demonstrate the step by step procedure of developing the TIG weld joint. Okay. Now our machine is in off position, and the gas is also off. So by adjusting the knob of the argon cylinder, the gas flow is initiated, and through the control valve its flow rate can also be adjusted to see really if it will be 10 liters per minute or 12 liter or 15 liter per minute, like that. Okay. So after the setting of the welding current and ensuring the proper supply of the argon gas and setting choosing the suitable type of the welding current, like say this is the aluminum, so we will be using the AC, and considering the sheet thickness, say the current has been set at as a at 120 ampere for the constant current setting. Okay. Now we will be seeing that how do we start. So start the arc, and then using the filler the bead will be deposited, okay, using the GTAW process. Now initially we will strike the arc. So now you say the arc has been initiated and it will be generating very intense heat. So in order to utilize this arc heat, we have to bring it close to the plates to be joined. At the same time, we have to feed the filler metal so that the bead can be developed as per the need. When they say TIG welding is performed, say in case of the similar metal, okay, in the similar metal welding, or when the bead on plate is developed, or simple, the heat is applied by the TIG arc on the surface of the metal. Then what happens with the variation in the Vi by S? Say welding speed is constant and the voltage is constant for a given electrode, then what happens with the increase of current? So, this is an example of, say, the when steel plate, say of 8 thickness, when a arc is passed through the surface, then what we get when we are using the 100 ampere current, this is the weld pool. And when the heat is supplied, part of the heat is also dissipated to the underlying base metal, and that produces the heat affected zone. So, obviously, the properties of the molten the metal, which after the solidification will be producing the weld metal, those will be different from the heat affected zone and the base metal. So, there are 3 zones if we see in each of the kind of the sample that is produced due to the melting followed by the solidification. So, here this is the base metal and this is the heat affected zone and this is the weld metal. Okay. So, if we have to see this typical characteristic, the weld metal structure. So, here the width is greater than the depth. So, why it is happening? Because we supply the heat at the top and the maximum temperature is generated at the center. So, maximum temperature is at the center means the surface tension and viscosity of the molten metal at the center will be minimum. Okay, while the surface tension and viscosity will be maximum at the boundary where the temperature is just corresponding to the melting temperature of the parent metal. And because of this difference in surface tension and viscosity, what happens? The molten metal tends to flow from the low surface tension zone towards the high surface tension zone. And therefore, what we find, the heat being delivered by the arc at the top, okay, this is transported towards the side due to the typical flow of the molten metal from the weld center towards the fusion boundary, and therefore we find that greater melting takes place at the sidewise as compared to the lower side. Okay, that is why we get the wider and shallow weld, where the depth is shallow and the width is more. Okay, but when we increase the heat input, certainly our width of the weld is increased, heat affected zone is also increased. So, that this HZ width will keep on increasing with the increase of the heat input, and the weld pool size will also be increasing without significant increase in depth. Okay. So, this is known as, and why this is happening? This is because whatever heat is being supplied from the top, that will be transported towards the side due to the typical flow of the molten metal in the weld pool. Okay. So, if we see a typical weld pool in case of the dissimilar metal weld, okay, in case of the dissimilar metal weld, say one side we have the ferritic steel, ferritic martensitic steel P91, another side we have austenitic stainless steel. So, because of the higher thermal conductivity, what we find, the more heat is dissipated towards the ferritic side and less towards the austenitic side, and therefore, we find the greater weld pool portion on the ferritic side, greater heat affected zone because heat is dissipated up to the greater distance as compared to that of the austenitic stainless steel side. So, for this kind of the welding, say, so this is the asymmetric weld. If we see the welding current in this particular case used was 230 ampere, welding speed is 80 per minute, weld arc voltage 15 to 16 volt, and the net heat input is 1.86 kilojoule per mm. That is what, assuming that its thermal efficiency is, so net heat input we can calculate from the Vi by S, and thermal efficiency is here 0.7 multiplied by 15.5 multiplied by 230 divided by 80. Okay. So, this is what B will be giving us divided by 80. So, here we can divide it with the 60 for converting into the second. So, this is what will be giving us the kind of the net heat input. Then we will see how to characterize the weld bead geometry. Say when the weld joint is developed like this, so it produces the various geometrical features. So it is important that the low magnification images of the weld joint is captured, and for that we need to use the stereoscope. This particular example, where in this particular case study we have used the activated fluxes with the TIG welding. So what happens when the dissimilar metal combination like P91 and 316, these are welded in presence of the with the little offset. Offset is towards the 31 side because of the low thermal conductivity. So because our P9 weld is shifted more towards the P91 side. So what we do, we try to offset the electrodes axis towards the 316 side. Okay. So that this is one of the way, and we also use the activated fluxes that helps in realizing the greater depth of the penetration due to the reversal of the Marangoni convection as well as constriction of the welding arc. So say A-TIG was performed using this current and this voltage, this speed, and a pure argon supplied at the rate of 10 liter per minute, and the net heat input is 22.88 kilojoule per mm. Assuming that the thermal efficiency of 70%, the net heat input is 2.01 kilojoule, and single pass welding, because through thickness penetration was realized in one pass. Okay. So this was the sequence for the multi-pass welding was used, where the first pass was used using the low current, that is 1, and then other 6 passes were developed using the filler of the inconel 82, and the groove, this is the groove geometry which was prepared for development of the dissimilar metal, dissimilar steel joints using the multi-pass approach. So idea was to let us compare that how the characteristics and the joint morphology becomes different in the two cases when A-TIG single pass welding is performed or multi-pass TIG welding is performed. And further, to characterize the thermal history and the weld thermal cycle, the thermocouples were located at the different locations on the two sides like this, at these two locations of 10 and 15 mm from the weld center. So this is showing the top view and this is showing the bottom view of the plate. Okay. Sorry, this is the A-TIG weld joint and this is the multi-pass TIG weld joint. So the weld bead geometry, if we see, is still on the weld is more shifted towards the P91 side because of the higher thermal conductivity, but it is not that asymmetric. Okay, and weld width is 10.53, and the heat affected zone width, if we see, distance from the HZ width from the weld center is 11.8, and that is what we can calculate from the fusion boundary. And then the depth of the weld that was realized, the weld bead width, the depth that was realized in single pass was 8.788. Okay, this is the kind of the dissimilar metal weld joint which is made using the single pass A-TIG welding or activated flux GTAW process. What happens when the multi-pass is used? Multi-pass uses very low heat input, and say so what we get, basically the width of the weld is narrow, like it is relatively narrow as compared to, because we use the less heat input in case of the multi-pass, and then depth to width ratio is 0.9, and the HZ width is here 8.13, so which is less as compared to that of the A-TIG. A-TIG uses the higher heat input as compared to the multi-pass. Now I will summarize this presentation. In this presentation, basically I have talked about the tungsten inert gas welding and its variant activated flux GTAW for development of the weld joints of the similar steel and dissimilar steel. Thank you for your attention.